Welcome back to Meet the Candidate Night, sponsored by the Independent American Party. Tonight we are talking to Dwayne Vance, who is running for the Congress in the 1st Congressional District, and Tim Aalders, who is running in the 4th Congressional District. I want to go back to a question that we asked before the first break, and that is with respect to deficit spending. Tim, we'll start with you. How do you feel about the government's deficit spending program that has lasted actually for quite a period of time?
You know, I've spent the last 5 years fighting deficit spending in government, interviewing every U.S. senator, every congressperson, talking about the abuse that they're piling onto our children and our posterity. Deficit spending is a problem both the Republicans and Democrats, like Dwayne earlier said, suffer from. It's a disease. They're just like any addict, heroin, cocaine, alcohol, and we have our politicians with deficit spending. Government should only spend what they can generate, and they keep looking to us to bail out their spending habits. And a lot of the things they're spending money for are not given to them. The authority is not granted to them, at least in the U.S. Constitution. They've just seized that power. Deficit spending needs to be addressed. We need to quit voting to raise the debt limit. And like Dwayne said, both Republicans and Democrats have a habit of doing it when their president's in charge and then saying how bad it is when the other party's in charge. Yet we seem to have short memories as U.S. citizens. We need to stand up, and we need to have our representative stands up and just say enough's enough. Let's start cutting these agencies, cutting these programs, and getting back to only spending what we bring in.
And along those same lines, as a businessman, I look at this from a businessman standpoint. I had to do some deficit spending on a short-term basis in order to get my own law firm up and running. But I had to plan to pay it back, and I paid it back, and now I'm no longer doing deficit spending because it's not sustainable on a long-term basis. And there are a lot of facets of this deficit spending that a lot of times get overlooked. Our deficit and our national debt is actually much larger than the numbers that get reported because the numbers that get reported don't include unfunded liabilities. For example, on a yearly basis, on an annual basis, our annual deficit would be much larger than it is now if they didn't rob from Social Security. All of the money that we pay into Social Security is used to pay for who knows what in the federal budget, and the money's not there. It's not in a trust fund. It's not in a retirement account like you would with a private pension plan or a private 401k or something like that, to pay these benefits when people are actually starting to cash in on them. And so it's a much more widespread problem than even many people believe and understand. The other thing that Tim touched on that I think goes right to the heart of one of the biggest problems with the federal government and money in politics is the money that they're spending, again, goes far beyond the scope of what the federal government should be doing. And where's that money going? It's going out to special interest groups. It's going out to bail out corporations that make campaign donations. It's going out to all of these places that eventually will come back and benefit the politicians, benefit their own campaign war chests, quite frankly, benefit their own pocketbooks and help keep them in office. And that's part of the problem with the money in politics is this deficit spending. If we limited the federal government to just the narrow scope of what they're entitled to do as it's set forth in the Constitution, that would drastically cut down on the existing federal bureaucracy and the related spending and would have a dramatic impact on the national debt and the deficit spending that's going on.
What would you do with respect to Utah lands? Utah lands are owned mostly by the federal government. What effort would you put forth, Dwayne, to help bring those lands back to the ownership of Utah? Would you join the Western governors' efforts, and how would you otherwise support that issue?
Again, I think this is a states' rights issue, and I would absolutely support the Western governors and the states in trying to reclaim control of these lands. And I think it goes right to the House, right to the floor of Congress. I would actually introduce legislation whereby the federal government would relinquish control over those lands, because I don't think the federal government has any business controlling those lands. This is something I had a great discussion with one of my neighbors on, and a good friend, where he, very passionately disagreed with me and doesn't think the state, is smart enough to manage its own lands. And I looked at him and says, "You honestly think that the federal government is doing a better job?" And what people don't understand sometimes, it's far beyond just the national parks. Here in Utah, we have a lot of national parks, and I love the national parks. We have some state parks, and I love the state parks. I think the states would do just as good of a job running, all of the parks as they do the state parks. But it's the BLM land. It's all of this wilderness land. It's all this open land that then the federal government leases out to corporations and businesses. Again, businesses that will donate to them. It's a vicious cycle here. And it just gives the government influence in an area which they have no business being to begin with anyway. And again, getting back to the short answer is I would affirmatively push legislation to relinquish control over state lands.
I sit and look at the state land issues, and I've given a lot of advice to Representative Ken Ivory and a lot of other people in the state legislature on how they're doing it. What I don't like is that if we had a contract with the federal government that the land was supposed to revert back to our ownership, why are we asking permission to take back what's ours? We're basically saying we have no rights. You go ahead and we'll come begging to you for what belongs to us. I've told us if this is our land, if these are our resources, let's start getting them. Let's start mining them and have the federal government come in here and force us off of our land. That would be a political and a PR nightmare for the federal government. Yet, like Dwayne says, the only place to really fight it is on the floor of the House or the Senate, which we're running for the House, with legislation. Proposed legislation that restores all the western states' land that should have been turned back over to them with the BLM to the states. And then we educate people, we get those state representatives on our side, but we educate East Coast people because they don't really realize what the differential is between them owning 97% of their land or 98% of their land to where we only own 61%, and Nevada owns a very small percentage of their land. We have to stand up and fight on the floor where it matters. Giving the speeches on TV is great, words are great, but if we don't formulate legislation and try to pass it and try and educate people about it, that's the biggest platform we have, yet we don't utilize that enough in Washington, D.C.
Our country is engulfed in war and foreign policy issues. Tim, what's your position on the way in which the federal government has executed these wars, and what's our responsibility toward people in the Middle East or other nations in terms of sending our troops, our manpower, our military to those regions of the world?
Well, first off, let's say what it is. It's not a war yet. We haven't had a declared war since World War II. What we have is a political gaming being done by our politicians. We create the enemy. We armed and created the people to fight in the Middle East, and then they turned on us. We armed them again the other day. We dropped crate after crate of small arms to Kurdish people labeled by our own government as a terrorist watch group. And they said a majority of those small weapons they think ended up in the right hands. That's saying 49% didn't. So we're arming both sides of a conflict, and we're sending our young men and our young women to fight for a war for countries and a culture that hates us. And just because we give them weapons don't make them hate us any less. This policy of where the enemy of our enemy is now our friend has not worked out well for us for decades. And it's just not good. We can't secure our own border, but we'll arm up every enemy against the United States, mostly because the corporations like General Dynamics or Halliburton or L3 Communications and some of these other people that make these huge military contracts their only profit model, if you take this back to business, is they profit off of war. If they don't sell their weapons of war, they're not making any money. So we always need a conflict. So we're in this never-ending conflict with our government to make up for the campaign contributions they give both the Democrats and Republicans. And to me, that's wrong. We should only fight a war if there's a direct and proven threat to our sovereignty here in America.
And I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but it all comes back to the Constitution. And under the Constitution, Congress is the one that has to make a declaration of war. And a declaration of war should be very well thought out. It should be debated. It should be, a very thoughtful decision, and then a committed decision with a stated objective in mind and a resolution to that. we haven't had an actual declaration of war since World War II, and I think that's the problem, there's no well thought out plan. It's not a thoughtful action. It's a knee-jerk reaction. It's, jumping in here, jumping in there, who knows what. We need to get back, and if we're going to commit our armed forces, if we're going to commit our military strength, and most importantly, if we're going to commit our sons and daughters' lives to go fight overseas, I believe it should only be under a formal declaration of war.
We want to, before we go to some closing statements, just remind you that we will be back here next week at the same time, Tuesday evening, October 28th at 8 o'clock, right here on TV 20, where we will continue the discussion with Dwayne Vance, who is running for Congress in the 1st Congressional District, as well as Tim Aalders, who is running for Congress in the 4th Congressional District under the banner of the Independent American Party. We want to turn a last few minutes over to each of them individually to give us some closing remarks. We will start with Dwayne, and then we will move over to Tim Aalders. Dwayne?
On a closing note here, let me just kind of hit what I think is the touchstone of my campaign here. In addition to the Constitution, it's accountability to the people. We want to go back to Washington as representatives of the people. I have no desire to be a career politician. In fact, I don't think anybody should be a career politician. I think our founding fathers envisioned and designed this government specifically to where serving in public office should be a privilege, and it should be a sacrifice, and it should be for a limited period of time, and then you should rotate out and come home and let somebody else go back with fresh ideas, with new energy, who can attack the problem. I do have that energy, and I will go back and attack the problem. But ultimately, I'm going to represent the people. I'm going to be accountable solely to the people. I will not let any political party tell me how to vote. I will not let any special interest groups tell me how to vote, and I will not let any campaign donors tell me how to vote. Now, a lot of politicians say that, but their actions speak louder than words. Give me a chance, and if you're not happy, bring me home. And more importantly, if you're not happy with the representatives you have in there now, bring them home.
As we said once before, I'm Tim Aalders. I'm running for the 4th Congressional District. I'm a national radio host that broadcasts on K-Talk AM 630, former business person, business consultant. First off, I want to thank my family for supporting me when I have this passion for saving America. My wife, Lori, my kids, Sarah, Ethan, and Brandon. And I want to thank God for giving me a voice and giving me the will to stand up and fight. Listen, we have a lot of politicians who answer to a lot of people, and none of them reside within our borders of this state of Utah. They take a lot of money, millions of dollars, to take a job that pays $174,000, and they say those millions of dollars comes with no strings attached. Over 10,000 pieces of legislation was submitted in 2013, none written by any representatives of Congress. No longer do we have politicians that are representing us. The one thing I can promise you is I'll promise you I won't take their money, I haven't taken their money, and I'll represent you. And I'll represent you to the best of my ability with your direction and the state's direction and the direction of the U.S. Constitution. We have to stand together. Don't waste your vote again this year. Don't vote for Republicans and Democrats. Insanity, the definition, is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. This year, you have an option. Stand up, get off your couch, get other people you know have given up, and get them out to vote. Tim Aalders, 4th Congressional District, Dwayne Vance, 1st Congressional District. We'll represent you. We'll come back to the state. We'll have our town halls, our discussions. We'll educate you on legislation that's going on, and we'll listen to what you care about most. We appreciate you. Patriot Financial, the correct number is 243-7720. And we'll see you Tuesday, the 28th, 8 o'clock p.m. here on Channel 20. Thank you. Good night.
Hi, I'm Dwayne Vance, and I'm running for Congress in Utah's 1st Congressional District.
And I'm Tim Aalders, and I'm running for Congress in Utah's 4th Congressional District.
We are passionate advocates of the Constitution.
The Constitution is the firm foundation on which this great nation was built.
If we want to continue to have a sound and stable country in which we can live and raise our families, we need to stick to the firm foundation provided by the Constitution that has made it possible for America to thrive for so many years.
Otherwise, this great nation has the potential to fall just like Rome and so many other great empires who have come and gone in the past.
On November 4th, please vote for Dwayne Vance for Utah's 1st Congressional District.
And remember to vote for Tim Aalders for Utah's 4th Congressional District. And make sure to elect other people who will make the federal government follow the U.S. Constitution.
I'm Dwayne Vance,
And I'm Tim Aalders.
candidates for U.S. Congress,
We don't approve of what's going on in Washington.
but we do approve of this message.